You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
One of the people that I had the pleasure of meeting through doing Addressing Gettysburg or from doing Addressing Gettysburg is Dr. Peter Carmichael. He's the head of the Civil War Institute over at Gettysburg College. And, you know, I've seen him on TV long before I ever met him. And so it was great to meet him. And, you know, he's a very nice guy. He's very down to earth, very helpful. And you could tell that he just loves this stuff. And so he has a book that came out called The War for the Common Soldier, How Men Thought, Fought, and Survived in Civil War Armies. And he came on. We wanted to talk about that. And so Bob and I sat down with him over at the old studio at Destination Gettysburg at the old radio station and just talked about what life was like for the common soldier. And I loved it. It was great. And he was very helpful afterwards. He put us in touch with his publisher, and we've had a few of the authors on that we've got books from, and we're actually trying to get the remainder of the authors that we received books from, and we're trying to get them for this winter to come on and talk about their books. So anyway, Peter comes on, talks about the War for the Common Soldier, and this is it. He's a very interesting guy. If you ever get a chance to go and hear him talk, or if you ever bump into him around town or anything like that, go say hello to him. I think you'll enjoy a little conversation with him. So I hope you enjoy this conversation that Bob and I had with him on the 7 days of Christmas with Addressing Gettysburg. This is available over at our Patreon account, but of course you're getting it for free now, so you don't need to go over there to hear this, but there is plenty more where this came from. Fascinating people just sitting down and talking with us, and I think you'll like it if you join. So without further delay, Peter Carmichael.
Right.
You know, and I can work on this stuff.
Right.
And in exchange, I'm going to give you a deeper education. I'm going to interview experts about all different aspects, as long as I can tie it into Gettysburg somehow.
Yeah.
And so
there's plenty of Gettysburg. In fact, a criticism of my book is that there's too much Eastern theater and not enough West. And I said, Earl Hess, he's a good friend of mine, said that. I said, Earl, the cover of the book is an Indian regiment, by the way, an Indian regiment in Tennessee at Duck River. I said, come on, man, doesn't that count for something?
Have you gotten a lot of criticism for it?
Yeah, that's probably one part. I mean, it's the book is still pretty fresh in terms of when reviews, but I mean, that's certainly one concern.
But that happens with anything. You're going to get critics.
Yeah, I don't. None of that stuff bothers me.
Right.
I just got a really nice review out that a person really understood the book, right? And that's what you really seek for. I mean, lavishing praise is whatever, but when someone really sort of gets what the ideas that you're trying to put forth, that's when it's gratifying and somewhat reassuring, right? That you're just not writing and it's just going nowhere, which, I mean, we all need to be, I think, self-aware of the fact that we operate in pretty small ponds and these are just little ripples. Yeah. But, I still, and we can talk about this, I still firmly believe that the value of what we do collectively here, I speak for all of us, is we are recovering the voices of these men who I think deserve to be heard. And,
I agree.
And so that's kind of the motivating force behind it.
So, we've already started.
Yeah, whenever.
So here we are.
Yeah.
So what was the idea behind the book? What made you want to write this particular?
Yeah. So The War for the Common Soldier is part of the Littlefield series published by the University of North Carolina Press. It's a series that's dedicated to key issues or topics in the Civil War. And so the editors of the series, Gary Gallagher and Michael Parrish. Gallagher retired from University of Virginia. And Michael Parrish is a Baylor. I studied under Dr. Gallagher.
Yep.
I studied under him. So they invited me to write the volume on the Common Soldier. So that's how it began nearly 10 years ago. And what I was up against was an unusual challenge, and that's a field that is really fully matured, that there's so much exciting and impressive scholarship on the life of the common soldier that I was having a hard time to find my place within this historiography. So it took a while. because I didn't want to write just another book about why men fought. And I'm not diminishing that question. I think it's an important one. But historians like James McPherson and Joe Glattard, Chandra Manning, Susanna Urel, there's a very long list. And they've all done impressive and important work. So I was assigned the task of writing a book that synthesized existing scholarship and create a new argument or new interpretation. And that's what I was up against. And it required that I become a very different historian. I was trained as a social historian, meaning that I was primarily interested in finding the letters of these men and recovering their lives as they lived it. And I know I needed to go a new direction, which meant that I had to become a cultural historian, which I think there's a key difference. And when a cultural historian, you're more concerned about getting into the inner world of these individuals, not just what they thought, but how they thought. Making that leap to how they thought, I left a lot of folks behind. And we can talk about it. My editors were not particularly happy with this book in its first incarnation.
Why is that?
Well, they thought that the case study approach that I took, so this book pivots around, I'd say, roughly 15 to 20 individuals.
Okay.
They're deep contextual stories, they're narratives. And there was some question as to whether these individuals were representative of the common soldier. My argument to them is that there is no common soldier, and the search for one is an elusive one. It gets us really nowhere. I think rather we need to take men whose lives offer us an opportunity to not just explore how they thought, but to understand how they thought and acted within the broader cultural world that they breathed in, right? And for many, that approach is an approach that seems too disconnected from the evidence itself, that I'm too suggestive in places. You know, I will certainly live with that criticism.
Too suggestive in what way?
Well, that, for example, when you try to understand why a man deserted, they often don't write it out in some grand proclamation. These are the reasons why, from number one being the most important to to number 10. They don't do that, right? So what you have to do then is you have to look at that context, and it has to be a very deep read. In that context, for example, the 3rd North Carolina, a soldier in that regiment, John Futch, F-U-T-C-H, who fought right here at Gettysburg. His brother died in his arms at Gettysburg. He spoke his letters. He's illiterate. He spoke those letters to a number of men. Many of them were barely literate themselves. By piecing those things together and by looking at other sources, I get a sense of that world that he inhabited that go beyond just his words. I have a sense of that regiment in particular suffered, I think, significantly from a logistical breakdown after Gettysburg. I also have some sense of the breakdown on the home front, which is absolutely critical to understanding all these men. The idea we can go to this battlefield and just talk about right flank and left flank and not think about the households where these men came is just, I think, a grievous mistake.
I agree.
A grievous mistake. So that's how you start to piece these things together and to try to get at what I would say, and this was my goal, I wanted the totality of the soldier experience. How they thought, how they felt, how they smelled, how they touched. Right? I wanted all of that. Right. And that goes from the material things that they carried to the words that they wrote to their reactions and relationships with their comrades as well as their loved ones. I wanted to try to do it all instead of a snapshot approach. Don't say that too quickly.
Can I interject?
Yeah, please say it. Have your own opinions about this as well.
Well, no, not at all. Yeah. In fact, You introduce us to Oliver Wendell Holmes. Of course, most of us know who that was. And you end, in a sense, with Oliver Wendell Holmes.
For those who don't, who was Oliver Wendell?
Oliver Wendell Holmes was in the Harvard regiment. Yeah. He was Harvard educated. He interrupted his education. He became a soldier in the 20th Massachusetts. And he'll leave the service in 1864. And he'll go on to become Supreme Court Justice.
Yeah, that's right.
And he was a legal realist.
Yeah, that's right.
And he's going to change American jurisprudence on the Supreme Court. And I'm wondering if you didn't purposely focus on him in the end of the book because he is an example of this bare-knuckled pragmatism
that's right.
that you're writing about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a key theme that runs through the book is pragmatism. And I drew heavily from Louis Menand. I think that's how you pronounce his last name, Menand, Menand, who wrote Metaphysical Club. It's a brilliant piece of intellectual history. Much of it I don't quite grasp. Some of it I do. And the section on Oliver Wendell Holmes I drew from heavily. And I give Menand all the credit in the world. And what pragmatism simply is that men during the course of the war on both sides, they came to value an idea not for its intrinsic value, but for its practicality. Let me give you a quick example from Holmes and why, again, I relied on him. I think Menand thought that Holmes became less ideological. My point is that pragmatism actually allowed these men, in many cases, to hold on to their idealism. And so here's my example. After December 13th, those attacks against Marie's Heights at the Battle of Fredericksburg, in which Holmes was not able to be with his regiment, but he watched them. He watched them fight in the town of Fredericksburg and, of course, the assault against Marie's Heights. He was very taken, very moved by it all. I think he even acknowledged that he shed a tear. And then his father, who was, of course, no intellectual lightweight himself, wrote a letter to Holmes after Fredericksburg, after this great cataclysmic defeat, and said, "We will prevail, son, because our side has morality. We have God on our side. Our cause is the just cause. The rebel cause is not. And that's the reason why we'll prevail." Well, that just infuriated Oliver Wendell Holmes, who had just seen his buddies go to their death and go to their death in something that actually he almost admired. He did admire the professionalism of the men, their training, right? And learning from their mistakes. And so he wrote his father back, chastised his father, and said, "This is absurd what you're saying. What's ultimately going to decide this thing is professionalism, practicality. It is adjusting to the circumstances as they present to us. Right. If we live by high ideas in some dogmatic way, we're all going to just go to our death here and for no good purpose in the end." So Holmes's example is a powerful one, and because Holmes writes so brilliantly and so openly, he was a perfect case study, right, to introduce at the beginning of the book, but certainly to close with.
So can I just say,
go right
going back to your goal, I taught teenagers for 38 years U.S. history.
God bless you.
And,
right.
Well, had I given the assignment to find out what was life like for the soldier of the Civil War, at first brush, I wouldn't give your book at a certain level of creature comforts. I would go to a veteran like John Billings, Hardtack and Coffee.
That's right.
If they wanted to get deeper to the causes, well, let's go to McPherson, James McPherson for the audience. But boy, after this, I think you get all of it and another level here. And so let me sort of compliment you by paraphrasing Oliver Wendell Holmes. He said, "We have shared the incommunicable experience of war." I think, as well as any 21st contemporary historian, you have communicated the incommunicable experience of war. And you weren't part of it. But I know you've done it, and as you need to, through the words of the participants. And so I would say well done with that.
I mean, that means obviously a great deal. That's the kind of thing you want to hear as an author. But I think that your framing of what your assessment of my book is spot on. And you're actually pointing to what was one of the issues that made my editors uncomfortable. Because what they wanted this book to be was the first book that a person should read about the common soldier. I'd like to believe that could still work for somebody.
Why not?
I think it could. I think it could. I think that, I mean, I might still send someone, certainly Billings, I love that. I love Bell Wiley's book, The Life of Johnny Reb and Billy Yank, which, I mean, I draw from these individuals. And so in my attempt to bring all those layers of the soldier experience together, the level of complexity at times, I can understand why that might be challenging to some readers, but the case study narrative approach, I think, is what makes it accessible. And I think that one of my frustrations, and you all should speak to this as well, is that we're formulaic so much in how we write about the past. It's not just the Civil War, and we have a certain argument, and we are determined to prove that argument, and there is certainly value and merit to that. But there are times that mission to prove a thesis that I think it leads to an artificiality. And I'd even go so far as to say that it's really not history at all. Because we have that formulaic, which is, okay, I have my idea. It's a topic sentence for a paragraph. And then you get a few quotes. And let's be honest, especially in this subject matter, you can make any generalization about a civil war soldier and you could what? You could go and you could find it. Right. It's out there some way, somewhere, right? You'd be able to find it. Mm-hmm. And so what you often have in so much of the literature on the common soldier is the voice of the historian and then a few, again, well-chosen, juicy quotes that get the reader's attention, but it's so artificial. It's such a snapshot. So the case studies came down to one, I wanted to make sure I got men of all classes, and I did. And from the very poor to the rich.
Right.
I did that. Mm-hmm. And I got men from Union and Confederate armies, mm-hmm. from the East and from the West. But outside of that, what I wanted was a string of letters, meaning that I wanted letters over a sustained period of time so that the reader could see that there were many faces to being a soldier.
Right.
How these men change. It's never a state of being. It's always a process of becoming.
And you say that in the book, don't you?
Yeah, I do. I'm quoting myself. That's pretty obnoxious. Very obnoxious.
Well, no, but that's your point. But so I will say this, that this is my first book that I've read about the common soldier.
Oh, cool.
Because I'd never, until now, never really cared. I'm always more of the guy who's interested in the strategies of the generals and all that stuff. So to get this far down, I never really was interested in it. So I never read Hardtack and Coffee, although it is sitting on my table because I'm going to get to it someday. Yeah. So this is the first one, and I'm loving it so far. I'm not finished with it, but I'm loving it because it's hitting on everything that I have wondered about the life for the common soldier in the army. But there's something I noticed in the book. There's a lot of talk of God. And I know we were a more religious society back then. But I'm trying to discern. Is there a lot of talk of God in here because they thought a lot about God and they talked a lot about God, or are you a particularly religious person, or is that where are we coming from here?
I wouldn't say I'm particularly religious. I do go to a Civil War church in town, Christ Lutheran.
Okay.
So that's always an added bonus. There's a pattern. I lived in Richmond. I was Episcopal in Richmond because I wanted to sit in Robert E. Lee's pew, which I did in Richmond. So, anyone who studies Civil War America knows that, on the North and the South, there is a sense, a conviction that God is ordering daily affairs, earthly affairs, on behalf of his chosen people. Right. And that there's a certain order, a certain direction, a certain purpose that, again, that God's hand is behind. And that metaphysical understanding of the world, I think, is safe to say, is what most Northerners and Southerners, what they believe coming into the conflict in 1861. Mm. And that reference to providence as the war progresses, as you can see, there are all kinds of different expressions. I think there's another safe generalization, though, to be made, that no matter how pious a man was, if he was extraordinarily devout like R.E. Lee, as someone like William Tecumseh Sherman, who is a deist at best, and that's on a good day, right? Right. I think that there still was what wars, of course, do, is it created this great turmoil and this great confusion, not just in their physical world, but in their very understanding of how the world operated. And soldiering, as I came to appreciate, especially for those on the ranks, right, on the ground, that was extraordinarily traumatic because, one, things are not playing out in an orderly and predictable way. There's very hard to discern the hands of God, right? Mm-hmm. But then another important layer, there's a sense of entrapment that these men felt that they were not used to from their civilian life, right? Mm-hmm. They're told what to do and when to do it. And then on top of that is the inability to get information in any predictable and consistent and reliable way. Their world is surrounded by rumor. It's impossible for us, I think, to know that or to understand that. Unless maybe you go back to your college days in a dorm where, right, everything is rumor. But for these men, it's extraordinarily frustrating, right? To not know the truth when you came into the war believing that truth was attainable. I'll just very quickly give you a soldier quote. A guy named John Wiley, who became so frustrated that he wrote to his wife, shit. That's what he said.
Yeah.
Shit. So we can't believe anything around here. And so what I wanted people to get a sense of is that the instability of knowledge and the instability even within their spiritual lives, did they all turn to deism? Did they all become atheists? And absolutely not. I didn't think if you ever gave up on God. I didn't find that.
Right.
But I found men who became providential pragmatists.
There probably were, but you didn't find.
I didn't find them.
Right.
They weren't quick
on
to
the whole. They
acknowledge
didn't
it.
give up on God.
They didn't.
Which is amazing to me because, because what they're seeing is. So Bob and I were talking about this yesterday. Correct me if I'm wrong. I see that generation as a lot more naive in many ways than we are today. In certain ways, we're very naive that they weren't naive. And like Bob said, that that death was a very common thing for them. And I said, yes, but not death where you're standing next to your friend and the next minute his head is off his shoulders. Right. And that's traumatizing death. Yeah. And you're doing this repeatedly for months or a year or 2 years or 3 years, however long you're in this service for. How did they handle all that stuff?
Bob, do you think soldiers were naive? No. On both sides? No.
Going into it, I mean.
Oh, I think you're probably right about that.
Yeah, I don't mean because I mean my example.
I thought we were talking theologically here.
No.
Naive in the sense of they haven't seen the elephant.
Correct.
Right? They don't know.
Now explain for the newbies what that term means.
They haven't experienced combat.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's my point.
I think you have, though, an interesting idea, though, that we can see how these men continue to persevere. And I think that most of the existing scholarship books on this subject point to a lot of very good reasons for that. I think a lot of it is the power of the ideas, that this loss of life was, it was worth continuing the fight. And you could honor that loss of life of your comrades by doing the very thing that is so inexplicable to us. But I will quickly say, and what's a big part of this book, and another thing that my editors did not particularly care for, is coercion is a major part of civil war armies. Bob, I'm curious, you and I have not had a chance, unfortunately, to get together. I hope we will after this. I get to meet a lot of the guides. In fact, they're going to come to my conference. We have a whole panel the battlefield guides are going to be on. And I'm curious what you do on the battlefield, because I've given a lot of tours, and I often don't talk about the power of coercion. And what I mean by that is that there is the real, not just threat, but the reality that if you don't keep your place in the ranks, that there will be, at minimum, a penalty of humiliation. To give you a quick example of one, in the Army of Tennessee, an officer who didn't do his part was forced to walk in front of the entire front ranks of his regiment, and as he walked by each soldier kicked him in the rear end. Right? Or they put a placard on a man that would read coward. Or, of course, you can only imagine how the grapevine of news made its way back to those communities.
Yeah.
And then there's, of course, always the threat of execution, which almost never happened for cowardice, just for desertion. My point being is this. When we get on the battlefield to give these talks, it's really easy to see these men as of a different age, and they were certainly very different from us. But they kept their place in that ranks for a variety of reasons. And the one reason, or reasons, that we often don't think of because they're invisible, but not to the men, it's coercion. It's coercion. How many times, Bob, I'm curious, do you ever have your group say, you know what, we're looking along lines of advance toward Pickett's charge. Let's turn around and look into Spangler's Woods. What do you think you'd see there? Do you ever do that? Bob, have you ever done it? I do it all the time now. It's taken me a while. Yeah. I mean, as you know, and do you give battlefield tours too?
I've taken friends and family around.
Fun,
yeah, sure.
It's great, man. It's that connection to the ground.
Never for money. Never for money.
Never for Yes, I'm always doing it for
I don't have a license, so I don't do it for money.
So, I have people turn around and look at Pickett's charge. What do you imagine? Right? Yeah, not just the walking wounded, but you should also see enslaved people there. There are a lot of African Americans on this battlefield. You should see enslaved people, and you should also see what they called shirkers. Right? E.P. Alexander has a great example. The artillerist who orchestrated much of the bombardment on July the 3rd. And he saw two men rifling through what he thought was the possessions of a dead officer. He rode over to those two men, said he was going to press charges against them. And they turned to him and they said, "This man's not dead. He's our surgeon. And he does this before every battle. He gets drunk and we're taking his instruments, right?" Right? And there's a longer story to that in fighting for the Confederacy. But my point being is, and what I ask myself all the time, and Bob, I'm sure you all do this, what stories are told here? What are the stories that people want? And I'll tell you what they often want, and what we too often give them are bedtime stories.
Yeah.
That's what they want.
Yeah.
And I absolutely have obvious strong reservations about that. I want to tell the stories of Pickett's Charge and those men who conform to that vision of Civil War heroism. I want to tell that story, but I also want to tell the story that Alexander related as well. They got to be side by side. And when we do that, we get the idealism or the naivete that you're mentioning, as well as the coercive forces, which I think are very much there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, war is a human experience. Human beings are doing it, and not everybody's different, and they all handle things. It's a horrible, traumatic experience that most of us, thank God, haven't actually lived through.
That's right.
So how do we know how anybody would react? The fact that these people get up the next morning and stay there. Right. So what if the guy gets drunk before a battle? I mean, it's better than blowing his head off.
Well, you're exactly right. The drinking that pervaded both armies during a fight is far more, I think, extensive than what we've ever imagined before. And again, none of that should surprise or shock us. But I had to come to this project again from a different angle, and I had to think about these men as letter writers, and that included thinking about their audience. And I'm not suggesting that these men misled the people back home, but they made choices as writers, and in so doing, there's silences in the text. And that's a better answer from one of your earlier questions, and that is this turn toward cultural history, in which some would say, well, Pete, there's a silence. How do you interpret a silence? Well, I think you absolutely can interpret a silence. And I think the silences are deafening. I think that they're telling, and they reveal to us a great deal about what these men endured and what they went through.
Well, when you're saying a silence, what do you mean by that?
Right. So again, here's a good example. We'll keep it to Gettysburg.
Okay.
So, again, my advisor, Dr. Gallagher, is like a father to me, and we have differences, and that's to his credit. Early on, he said, we'll disagree, and that's perfectly fine. Right?
Sure.
And so he wrote, I think, a very important piece on Confederate reaction to Gettysburg.
Okay.
And in it, he makes the argument that for the vast majority of men in Lee's army, that certainly they looked upon what happened here as a defeat, but not something that was cataclysmic or devastating. In fact, many of these men, as he writes and as he shows in the evidence, these are men who, in fact, blame the Confederate reverse on the impregnable Union position, and then they immediately start to look for reasons as to why that they were actually victorious in the end, which is, of course, is just mind-boggling to us, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons is that the Federal Army did not pursue aggressively. If, in fact, that army, the Union Army, was in a formidable condition, it would have, in fact, continued the attack, which it did not. All right. So, look, I said to Dr. Gallagher, it doesn't conform to the reality. Stephen Dotson Ramser's letters to his wife during the retreat speak of the retreat as basically a band of brothers that is still holding it together. There's no sense that this army was unraveling, and we know that for a fact. And so the question is, we have to move beyond just simply saying, well, this is a distortion that Ramser put forth. Why is he lying? Why is he deceiving? That doesn't get us anywhere. What we need to understand is the cultural lens that caused him to project or represent that experience the way he did. He is silencing the desertion that occurred, right? There's the silence. Okay. And he's doing it through the cultural lens of honor, among other things. But honor is critical here,
sure,
especially among Southern men who feel this great compulsion to be seen as always masters of their world. And so a defeat, a loss, especially to the Yankees, is a very difficult thing for these, particularly Southern officers, I should add, for them to be able to write about and to accept. So it's the projection. So what I'm getting away from here is I don't Dr. Gallagher would say to me, well, this is how he saw his world, end of story. And I would say, no, he saw his world this way, but then projected it on paper with a political purpose in mind. And that political purpose is, let's assure the folks back home that our prestige, it has not been in any way slighted by what happened at Gettysburg. Does that make sense? What I'm saying?
It does. It's like McLaws after Brandy Station. I think he writes to his wife and he says something like, the Yankees weren't thrown back across the river. They retreated on their own, at their own leisure. And I suppose they've accomplished what they've come over here for. But it's best we let the lie prevail or something like that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Because, Zeb Stewart was certainly embarrassed by what had happened there.
Yeah.
Yes. And the press wasn't kind to him about that.
Those letters of Ramseur's were to his wife.
That's right.
Correct?
Nellie, is that Nellie?
And so let me use that as a bridge, and I'm going to quote something from your book that So the quote is visions of battlefield immortality, and this is from the first chapter. Filled the heads of Union and Confederate volunteers who breathed in the heavy air of sentimentalism.
I like to point out the sentence is a bit much, but we edit that. Right. Yeah.
So what I want you to do is two things, because it's two of the really, I think, strengths of the book. One is describing this cultural milieu that these men have come out of, both North and South.
That's right.
And so I want you to explain a little bit what this sentimentalism, what that's like, but also the other strength of many in the book is that constant looking back. Ramseur's writing to his wife, not to the politicians, because of some of that sentimentalism, if I'm not mistaken. So
sentimentalism is a cultural lens that is the dominant one in the North and the South. And certainly it manifested itself in its own unique ways. But broadly speaking, sentimentalism is the belief that an individual can be the master of his circumstances and control those circumstances. And so if you want to get a sense for that idealism or that naivete that you spoke of, that's where it comes from. And it actually is a source of great optimism that the individual can accomplish and control. It's the emotion is the emotion of cheerfulness. That's a key component of it.
Right.
The other part of sentimentalism is that the highest state of that culture is to have character. And to have character as a man in particular is to be pious, is to show control and self-restraint in terms of your emotions, to be extraordinarily brave, and of course to have a great love for not just for family but for nation. All of those things coming together on both sides is the cultural air that they breathed in. It helps us understand the aspirations or expectations they had when the war began. And of course, as we know, the reality of war dealt some heavy blows to sentimentalism. And I would call them, and I don't know if I use this language, I hope I didn't because it sounds weird when I'm about to say it. Ready? Let's brace ourselves here. Hardened sentimentalists, right? That's what they were. I mean, they never ever still lost that belief that the individual, right, could attain or could control one's environment. And let me be now very specific about it. Right? We go to pick a charge and we ask ourselves time and time again, how could they do this, right? There are many explanations. We've already touched on some, but let's get to a very practical one. And that's the weaponry that Civil War armies used. And the weaponry, and there's again a lot of debate and conversation about the range of musketry fire during the Civil War. We know that it went all the way out to 500 yards. But I think we can all generally agree that most Civil War combat occurred 100 yards or less, usually around 75 yards. It was pretty quick and it was pretty decisive. That's an important point that everyone needs to hold on to, because you can, as a Civil War soldier, you can be audacious and you can be brave, because for much of the time, that fire that's directed at you is going where?
Over your head.
It's going over your head. It's going over your head. So for those cultural aspirations to have their meaning, to have hold on a people, there has to be a reality in which they can practice it without annihilating themselves. And I'm sure many of your listeners are saying, good God Almighty, what does this guy know about the Civil War? Because the body count is so incredibly high on so many different battlefields. And that is true. But it's also true that we can look at the war all the way to its bitter end April 2nd, 1865, outside Petersburg, and there are Union assaults, and they are attacking in formations that they deployed right here at Gettysburg. Now, they've evolved some,
Right.
especially in the 6th Corps and the Army of the Potomac. They're very creative in how they attack. But the point being, again, is the high ideas of sentimentalism, which you spoke of or quoted me from. You've got to get that. You've got to understand that, and you've got to know that it helped give these men a sense of purpose, and it gave the slaughter deep meaning, and yet there's a practicality to this, and the practicality is on this battlefield in which the weaponry allowed much of that to occur. There'd be people who disagree with me about that. Scott Hartwig, I don't know if you've ever had Scott here.
Yeah, we've
Scott?
got him on. Yep.
Yeah. Scott has a very different sort of take in describing Civil War tactics. He sees the formations as much looser instead of shoulder to shoulder. Earl Hess is someone whose work I value, as I do Scott's. The bottom line is that they did linear formations. I think when possible, those formations got a little bit loose, a little bit more open. But those formations at the end of the day corresponded to the weaponry in which you could really only fire 2 times a minute. You could maybe go up to 3, but it's mostly 2. You got to concentrate firepower. The only way you can do that is
Close range.
There you go. Right. Iverson's attack on July 1st. There you have it. Right. That's a good example of that.
So, if you don't mind, let me just
press as much as you want.
The book didn't go there, but this kind of sentimentalism will not survive worldwide 2 world wars in the 20th century.
So, yes and no. I mean, it certainly survives, and I think even vestiges of it get through World War I. I mean, although we focus on the lost generation and just a handful of British poets, certainly there are plenty of survivors of World War I who still retain those beliefs that war makes a man and that the individual can't ultimately prevail. I think some of those assumptions still guide men into World War II. But I think you're correct that after that, we start to see it becoming a little bit more diffuse, and that's maybe not even the right word. How about diluted? It doesn't have that same sort of adhesive hold on men. And again, I would in part say because the weaponry has changed. And now, obviously, I'm starting to speak out of turn here because my knowledge of modern warfare is extraordinarily limited, and I can't even imagine how men and women today feel about their power to control and shape what occurs on a battlefield. I'd be interested in knowing that. Right.
Well, and I'm no expert either, but it seems to me that the Second World War in particular, a belief in the basic goodness of human nature is going to take a major hit from people like Hitler and Stalin and so forth.
Yeah. They really give human nature a bad name.
Yes. And don't put Mao in there as well. I'm teaching this semester. I have fantastic students at Gettysburg College. I really enjoy them. And I'm teaching for the first time a class that I am uniquely unqualified to teach, 20th century world history at the 100 level, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And it's not the best teaching I've ever done, but it's the most important teaching because it affords me opportunities to talk about current events in ways that I am never partisan, and I keep my opinions back as much as I can. But to bring back to your point about Stalin, Hitler and Mao, throw him in, and probably throw a few others.
Mussolini.
Throw Mussolini as well. Yeah. Man, our century, the 19th century, is child's play compared to this.
Right.
And it's...
and that goes to my point about them being a little more naive. I mean, I think... Because what was it, 30 miles from home? That's about, nobody really went further than that in their lifetime. And here they're off in different states on the same continent, but still, it's a whole different world to them. And let's talk about...
I just want to, I guess a really good point. And I think we all need again to remind ourselves of how Civil War soldiers, and they acknowledged it, had entered what they believe was, they didn't use the word alien, but it felt very alien to them to be within a military environment. Now, they grew accustomed to it. Some never did. I was struck by how many truly pious soldiers, right, who really retained their faith throughout their service, found camp to be so unsettling. And what they particularly found unsettling were the sounds and the noises. That's the
read my mind because I was going to go to camp.
Of men sinking, that singing that really, really did get to them, right? And you can't escape that. Yeah. You can avert your eye, But it's hard to, right, unless you put cotton in your ears or something like that.
And even then, you can still hear things.
Still hear things.
That's right. Your ears can never, you can never close off your ears enough. No, but that's, so you bring up camp then.
Yeah.
So let's get into that, because that's something, you have to leave at 45, right?
I have I'm good.
Okay, you're good.
I have class at 2:30, and we're going actually to Little Round Top with my students.
All right.
Nice.
With Chris Quinn. Have you had Chris on the show?
He's coming on next week.
Yeah, he's fantastic. And a Gettysburg alum.
Tell him when you see him, say, I just did Matt's show, and it's the best time you'll ever have.
They were both, they were sober, which I was surprised by.
Yeah, but we won't be.
You obviously don't know the two of us. That's right. One of us is a bit of a teetotaler.
I've got my mind more in the mid 19th century than.
Wait, who's the teetotaler? Me or you?
I'm more the.
Oh, are you kidding me?
Well,
did you have to ask that question?
Well, I cut down a lot. Okay, no. So camp.
Yeah.
Okay. This is something that people always want to know about. They're fascinated by this stuff, and it is kind of I get in like a Freudian way. It's like the toilet phase of that we never really get out of. People want to know. Like you talk about how. First of all, did we get the term "caught with your pants down" from the Civil War?
I don't know. I've never heard that. Yeah.
Well, because you use it in here. I don't know if you use it or if it's in a quote, but you're talking about camp and how people would just drop trow and go anywhere, and they'd have to be careful not to get caught with their pants down. And I'm like, I wonder if that's where that comes from, because they always the whole 9 yards comes
I
out
don't know
of
where it comes from. Yeah. If I put that in there, I was not. Yeah.
If you can ask that question, I'm going to ask mine.
Well, wait, hold on. I'm not done with stupid questions. No, but talk about a little bit about sanitation and the camp life and how just men behave, because let's remember, these are young men.
Yeah.
They're men.
Yeah.
We're disgusting. Right? And so what is it? And I don't want to get prurient in any way or anything like that, but also like sexually, like what are these guys? How are they getting their releases? They're in the prime of their life, and they're in this situation. What's it all like? Tell me.
So I think this goes back to my earlier observation about they're letter writers, and they're writing for an audience. And so that, of course, leads them to make certain decisions as to what they will include and what they won't include. And there are certain soldiers, especially those who are not well educated, who are either semi-literate or illiterate, and it's those men who will write very graphically about especially issues of sanitation, about the lack of cleanliness, and about thinking now of a Louisiana soldier, Trans-Mississippi, who wrote in his diary time and time again about how the men would just defecate wherever they pleased. And of course, that's early in the war. They came again. Here's pragmatism for you, right? They started to recognize that, hey, wait, this is really unhealthy and people are getting sick, and maybe there's a connection here, right? So, but military discipline does kick in. And so even though they're volunteers and see themselves as citizen soldiers, it's in time, again, back to Oliver Wendell Holmes, the importance of professionalism. And it's not just on the battlefield, it's in camp as well. And so that discipline and that order and that control, which is critical, you look at any camp regulation that you can see how the tents are supposed to be organized, right? And where the enlistment men are and where the officers are. I mean, if you have any interest in Foucault, and anyone who says they understand Foucault, I hope you never have them on this show because they're lying to you.
I've never heard. What are you saying?
Foucault. You know Foucault.
No, I don't.
If you've heard Foucault before, look up Foucault.
You mean feng shui?
You mean a philosopher?
Feng shui. But you know, Foucault's all about, when he looked at prisons, about the degree of observation.
He's a philosopher?
He is a philosopher.
How do you
Look
spell
at
it?
Foucault. Foucault.
I think so.
I think I nailed that. Yeah. Listen, there's not any Foucault in my book. Anyway, I'm just saying but Foucault's great contribution is about power and also about crime and punishment. He's deeply interested in.
Humanistic and social scientific disciplines.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
He is absolutely unreadable. And like I said, anyone who says, I really get him, I read him, they're lying to you.
Yeah.
But there are people who've got good insights from him. And my point being here is that when you look at the regulations as to how tents, how camps were to be organized, right? You see again that there is a need for surveillance and supervision. There's your coercion at work, so that these problems that you are discussing, those problems of sanitation, that if the officers, if they are good officers, they're competent, they're conscientious, they're making certain that stuff doesn't go on, because they understand that it's jeopardizing the health of their men. Now, the sexual stuff, I would recommend Judy Ginsburg's book. It's a very thin volume. It's about pornography and Civil War soldiers.
Is it called Stories the Soldiers Wouldn't Tell?
Yeah, that's
okay,
right.
I lied. This is the second book about the common soldier I read.
Yeah.
That was the first one.
The one with pictures.
Yeah.
No, because that is an interesting. I recommend that too.
So it's Ginsburg. We might have got the titles confused here. The Story the Soldiers Wouldn't Tell is Thomas Lowry.
Oh,
He
yes,
wrote
that is correct.
That's right. And that's very anecdotal and quite good. Lowry was a great researcher. And then Ginsburg did something a little bit recently and looked at the campaign against pornography, and that story is rooted within the Civil War and it continues into the post-war period. The point being is, of course, man, these guys had access to pornography and
women.
And women. And there's a great set of letters, and boy, I wished I'd had it for this book, of an Illinois couple. They're called the Standards. Their last names. William Standard is his name and Jane is hers. And the book's published by Kent State. And I'll get you the title here. It'll come to me in just a little bit. He writes very openly, very graphically, and she even writes back, ask, how many men get the clap? She wanted to know. He described Louisville. This is his words, not mine. He said, Louisville's nothing but a big whorehouse. And then he writes about other men. He says, and I think he's doing all this to sort of make himself look better in his wife's eyes. And these other men that are going off and seeing prostitutes, and he names them. He names names, which is highly unusual. Right? And what's that, bro code?
Yeah.
There's bro code in the Civil War, but this guy didn't have it. And I'm going to get the title of that book before this is on. It begins with an I. I'm going to.
So before you came, Dr. Pete, can I call you Dr. Pete?
Just call me Pete.
Because one of the co-hosts sometimes is Pete, and this
Pete's
is
perfect.
Yeah. So all right, but anyway, before you came, we were expressing. We didn't use these words, but I am now. How we're glad your book wasn't a scratch and sniff, because when you were describing that camp at Corinth where they're defecating all over the place, we can almost smell it thanks to the descriptive powers.
Yeah, that's horrible.
But let me ask, because this was the stupid question that I was going to get. Remember, I said, "Let me ask a question if you're going to go there."
Yeah,
mine was going to be, I thought, really trivial and stupid too. But it's exactly.
Wait, what do you mean two? Like mine was?
Yes, it was.
So before you ask it, I'm going to throw in the title because of my feeble mind. Infernal War.
Infernal War.
I cannot say enough good things about that book. Again, an Illinois couple. You read her letters as well as his. Infernal War. It's about 2 years old. Published by Kent State. You can get it on Amazon.
See, I love to hear this stuff, though, because the same thing with Stories the Soldiers Wouldn't Tell, and we'll get to you in a second, Bob. The same with these stories. Wait, because I want to just finish this up so we move on to yours. But the Stories the Soldiers Wouldn't Tell, what I loved about it was seeing that these people who up until that point I had in my head these stoic, because if you always see them in the pictures, they're very stoic looking, very boring looking people, no smiles or anything, and then you see the letter that one chaplain was writing to a whore, and he's drawing pictures of his phallus and the F word in there and everything, and I'm like, wow, these people were just like us. But they hid it better. It's like a lie through omission, which I guess is kind of what you're talking about with the silence, right? It's lying through omission.
Yeah, that's right.
And so I love that. I can't wait to read this now because I like to see that these people are normal people like the rest of us.
There's a great, and then we'll get to your question. I'll be there fishing with this.
Just stay in the corner, Bob.
It's a fictional account of World War I written by a man who served in the trenches. His name's Henry Barbusse. It's called Under Fire. It's a great book. I love it. I assign it to my students, in fact. And in Barbusse, at the very beginning, again, he's taking his experiences at the front, but he creates these fictional characters. Right. And this man asked him, "Are you going to put in the cuss words?" And he said, "No, I'm not going to do that." And the man says, "Well, then you're not telling the true story of what went on."
There you go.
Right? So, there is a lot of self-editing there as well.
And you bring up cuss words. Again, sorry, Bob, 1 second, because cuss words, you say, there's that one quote where the guy starts off with shit, what do you know? Like, have you come across other cuss words that we still use today?
Yeah, I've seen. I saw the F word used in and this is a very serious matter here. This was a rape case. They asked the woman point blank, "Did he F you?" Really? Yeah. It
Like in?
They're
at a court martial.
Yeah, court martialing, and the guys were convicted and executed outside Petersburg.
And so the question was, "Did he F you?"
Uh-huh.
That's interesting.
Now, I have a number of cases. In fact, it's Tom Lowry who did the book on it. He's just did incredible stuff in going through court-martial records. And so because of his hard work, I was able to do keyword searches, right? I didn't do the F search. It doesn't get that kind of keyword. But I wanted to look at issues of rape.
Yeah. Because that had to be...
There were not as many as you would think. And there's some interesting work being done on that. Crystal Feaster at Yale is doing a book on sexual violence during the war.
Going back to pornography. So you're going to have the highest listenership of any podcast because we're talking about the F word and sex.
I have my kids listen to this. They were so eager to hear me on the radio, right?
So this will go from the ridiculous to potentially the sublime because I'm going to work in two questions then to segue.
Okay.
So this is silly, I know, but there used to be an example of Civil War pornography in the Gettysburg Visitor Center. I don't believe it's in the new Visitor Center.
No,
I'm sure it's not. My question for you is that a loss?
Absolutely. Of course it is. Yeah, no, I mean, none of these things. I mean, I'll hit this from a number of angles. In terms of the rough language that they deployed, the standards, the Illinois couple that I mentioned, they were very graphic. In fact, he writes a letter, and I'll edit one word out. He was upset that his brother-in-law didn't mention him in a letter. He's really angry. So he wrote back to his wife and he said, if he doesn't care enough about me, he can kiss I'm quoting him. I remember this quote. He can kiss my black ass. And if my ass isn't black enough, I'll bring him a wench from down south and he can kiss her ass.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah. Now, some other letters. John Foster, who... I wish I could tell you the title. Published by a family member. They're very well done. John Foster. It's, I think 118th Pennsylvania. It's a Zouave regiment on Little Round Top. You know the Zouave regiment that has a monument the monument's like the arm's broken or something.
You mean the 150?
Okay, good.
On Little Round Top?
Yes.
The 118th of the Corn Exchange.
Of course. What am I saying?
Okay.
What am I saying? That's not the 118th. I'm sorry. Yeah. So what is the Zouave regiment again on Little Round Top?
155th.
Okay, so he's in that. Yeah. In fact, he gets wounded at Little Round Top. John Foster, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And his letters are the most graphic I've ever read.
Really?
Oh, my God. He tells his wife how she should masturbate.
Really?
Like he should know.
Where do you find these?
So this is... I just bought them in hell. They're so published.
You bought them?
They're published. John Foster. You can look them on Amazon. And I'm sorry I don't know the title, but we've got the regiment again. Say the regiment again.
155th.
Yeah. He then goes on. He's so open that even prior to the Overland campaign, he's telling his wife he's angry at his captain. He feels like he's not getting promoted properly, and he's refusing to carry a musket. He said, "In the next battle, I'm going to desert," and he did just that. And then he writes from Washington, D.C. He's hiding out. And it's in the book. I hate it when people say that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Sorry,
but you're not doing it as a tease. You're just, all right, you mentioned desertion.
Hey.
What?
I got two questions, remember? You owe it to me. The ridiculous to the sublime.
Sorry, we didn't get the
although that's
sublime.
not
Okay.
ridiculous.
Okay, all right.
And I want to get this in because I know Pete better now. The opening chapter...
Yeah.
The opening description is of a painting.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Was that perhaps, as I was reading that, I could see you as a teenager, maybe younger, looking at that picture and with that analytical mind, which I now know better, wondering, what are those guys thinking? Why are they sitting apart from each other? This painting is in front of Yorktown.
Yeah.
It's probably the most famous painting from Civil War soldiering experience. Buy the book and you can see what it looks like. Right. But anyway, did that painting draw you into an interest in this subject?
Yeah.
Like use it to draw our interest into the book, into the lives of the men?
So surprisingly, it did not. I came to that painting very late. I don't even know where I saw it for the first time. I was so taken by, and you can pull it up. It's so odd. Can we get the right title? It's in front of Yorktown. Is that the title?
Yeah, in front of Yorktown.
Yeah, in front of Yorktown.
And it's and we can get the artist in there as
Winslow
well.
Homer. Did I say that? I'm sorry. Winslow Homer in front of
I
Yorktown.
wasn't sure if you had or not. I love Winslow Homer. Who doesn't, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, his war stuff is so compelling, and I love his seascapes after the war. So I don't know where I came across it, but I found it was so unusual in comparison to some of his other work, except there's always this great ambiguity with Holmes, right? Right? Or Winslow Homer, excuse me. Winslow Homer, there's this great ambiguity. And when you look at that painting, what's so odd is that at the very center of the painting is a big tree. It's a massive tree. Right? And then there's this fire, and on one side there are a few enlisted men who are huddled together, and then there's this sense of isolation and an officer on the other side of the fire pit, and the tree, of course, enhances that sense of divide. And what that painting did for me is that it conveyed that sense of physical intimacy and emotional intimacy, the closeness, right, that we all know pervaded the ranks, and yet there are these great tensions that existed, and it's not just between officers and enlisted men. Well, that certainly was the case. And so that's what I was taken by. That's what I was consumed by. That's what my editors didn't particularly like. They believe, and others do as well, that this book emphasizes what's called the dark turn in the Civil War. And we could talk a little bit about that. I think it's an interesting sort of subject. But the point of the dark turn is that it's not all heroic. It's not triumphant. I think we've acknowledged that a very long time ago, and that wasn't the point of what I was trying to do. I simply wanted to say that Civil War soldier couldn't be this or it couldn't be that, meaning you couldn't just say, hey, it's a band of brothers, nor could you say, hey, man, they're at each other's throats because there's all this class tension. There were moments there were all of those things. Yeah. And that painting, I thought, like all of Winslow Homer's work, it captures that ambiguity. Like, I love the painting of Petersburg. It's not called the crater. I don't think it is. Right? When the Confederate, that defiant
he's
rebel,
standing up above the trenches.
Right? But then there's that enslaved person. He's almost a caricature who's got the big smile thinking, what's that crazy white boy doing? Right? Right? Yeah. But I think it's his amazing. Yeah. Like, you're dying for what? Right? What are you doing here? Right? So I love that artwork. I mean, I think what got me going in this business, and probably for you all as well, is coming here as a kid. Yeah. My mom and dad, they did so much for me. And it's hard for me almost not to even get choked up, and my dad's no longer with me anymore. Right. And my dad was a Korean War veteran. And my dad screamed out in the middle of the night a lot. He'd never talk about it. And he'd give you little snippets, right? Right. But he could come here, right? And he wasn't very well educated. He barely had a high school degree. But the history here was powerful to him. He connected to it. My mom connected to it, right? Awesome. And so I think for all of us, right, it's the power of this place, right?
It's something about this place, because I grew up, before I ever came here, I grew up going to Virginia battlefields. And that was always fun. Those are cool. But when I came here, I came here on a field trip. I grew up in New Jersey. I came here on a field trip. It was a day trip. And I got home and I said to my dad, I'm like, Dad, we have to go back there. And every summer we came for a weekend, and I finally moved here. Like there's something, when I'm not here, I'm unhappy.
Right. Well, I think it goes to the importance of what Bob does. Right? Connecting people, connecting young people, and a reminder to all of us, young people care a great deal about the past. Vast numbers of our young people never get access to this place. And within our own county, we have a Latino community within our county, and I'm just going to be very blunt here, who deserve to go to that visitor center, as all poor people do, free. I'm sorry, charging poor people $15 to come. We're always talking about, and we racialize these things, and it drives me nuts. Black people don't come to the battlefield. Well, here's an idea. People in Baltimore, we'll take that community. Most of these are working people. They might get 2 weeks off a year. Right. You want them to come up and spend their money on this? Oh, come on, let's stop racializing these things, and let's make this battlefield truly accessible. That visitor center needs to have gradations in terms of price points. We poor people need to be able to come here. And I'm just saying what he does is so important, right? And we cannot give up on young people. As I hear, the cynicism that pervades this country is absolutely dangerous. So dangerous.
Towards the youth.
Yeah, and towards everything.
Well, towards everything,
Every politician is corrupt. They don't care about us. You know what?
Well, that's true.
That's not true. It's absolutely not true. We have a reminder every day the fragility of a democracy. And a democracy is at great risk when you lose faith in the institutions and the people that govern them.
Yeah.
We should not lose our cynicism, or excuse me, our critical eye. We all in agreement, but we need to stop this nonsense, right? And the language that we now deploy in which we talk about the other political side, I mean, I'll just say it. We should not have a president who speaks the way he speaks. And I'm a hardcore moderate, but I believe in civility and respect. That's what I believe in. And we should demand that from everybody. Right. And we should remind ourselves again, come here, remind yourself, this place where the Union was saved, and got to throw emancipation in there as well, right? Mm-hmm. Absolutely, right? It's a powerful place.
Right.
It's a powerful place.
It is.
You might be encouraged to know that some of us are doing that.
I know you are.
I'm at the Peace Light, and I'm sharing the prayer of the veterans for peace united, or peace eternal and a nation united. Yeah. And I'll just say, and boy, don't we need that now.
Absolutely.
And through the course of the tour, introducing individual soldiers like Jeremiah Gage or Alonzo Cushing, both 22 years old, both who will die here, and say, isn't it sad that we got to a point in our country's history that we could not work out a compromise anymore, because we had demonized each other in the years before, and we had used words. And I'll say, I don't care what side of the political divide you're on.
That's right.
If this war was fought today, there would be perhaps 7.5 million, since our population is more than 10 times the size, dead. So look at what happens when we don't treat each other as fellow human beings and respect.
I think you raised such a good point about the collapse of the two-party system and the failure ultimately to reach compromise. But I want to throw something out just for us to think about. I'm not saying I'm right. I'm not saying I'm wrong. I tell my students, I'm glad that there wasn't a compromise reached after Lincoln's election. I'm glad because everyone prior to Lincoln kept kicking the can, right, when it came to slavery and the expansion into the territories. And why I'm glad they didn't compromise, because when I think about the situation of an enslaved person in 1860, you want to tell that enslaved person, hey, we compromised this thing. That could be your generation, maybe the next, or maybe the one after it, right? Yeah. And so I'll say to people that any war and the sacrifice of life is a great tragedy. And for those who come out of it, I'm going to state the obvious. They don't come out the other side the same people.
No.
However, I do believe that there are times when organized killing is necessary. I think this is one of those times.
I agree.
And it's easy for me and my dad to say, well, hell, man, you weren't even in Boy Scouts. You couldn't shoot straight with a BB gun. What are you talking about, right?
Right. I understand.
Something to think
you
about.
Put very narrow parameters around that compromise period once Lincoln was elected. Right. So the Crittenden compromise at the end. Yeah. But I go back to the breakdown even earlier.
Yes, I agree.
To after the Revolution, or during the Revolution, Pennsylvania is able to find a way to free their slaves. It's a gradual emancipation, that's right. But we did it without bloodshed. And that's what I'm fearful of now. I see parallels between America today, not so much North and South, although interestingly it is in some regards. Right. It's more urban, rural.
Right,
it's
urban,
more
rural.
Republican, Democrat,
left, right, urban, rural.
Right, left, right. But the way we choose our words and we demonize each other and we don't realize that is a fellow American, that's what I rail against and worry about now.
Yeah. I mean, I have to, when I was a kid, so around 70s, 80s, right? We had 3 channels. My children were like, what? How did you live?
How did you survive?
So I was teaching high school kids in the 70s and 80s. So just to let you know how old I am.
So three networks, right?
Yeah.
And now we have Fox and MSNBC. And I watch them all. Yeah. And then I'm, of course, disgusted by them all. But they're 2 different realities. And
absolutely.
And I don't want to put too much responsibility on them, but I will, in fact. They're both, in their own ways, irresponsible.
Yeah.
They both are irresponsible. I mean, I assign my students The Economist, which is a British magazine. It's right to center, so they can't charge me with being some weenie liberal academic.
Yeah.
It's still right to central, and it's British, right?
Right.
And because I don't think that they can get objective news from either MSNBC or from Fox, and they need to find it elsewhere.
But Britain's media is all corporate owned too.
It is, but have you ever read The Economist?
I've read articles.
I think, look, I don't want to come across as this guy who reads, reads Freud, which I don't, right? Or Foucault.
He knows
I
Foucault,
don't.
yeah.
I know Foucault now, right? Right. I don't. And even with The Economist, like I read, but much of it is like over me. But still, it gives you a global perspective that is useful.
And if I'm being honest, I said I've read a couple articles of The Economist. I actually just have read the word economist. so let's be honest here. Real quick, and then because we're running for time, and then I want to get the listeners' questions in for them. Yeah, so go ahead, Bob. One more.
Can I?
Yeah, of course.
The first soldier you're introduced to us in the introduction is John Partington. He says on page 2 in the book something about the war, wanting the war to be, quote, done satisfactory to both parties, the end of the war. And I'm just wondering if that was done.
Yeah, that's a really big and important question. And again,
because it ties into today.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, Bob, I hope we get a chance to talk after this. I really enjoyed it, and as well, you're asking the right questions, and it's good to know that those are being asked on the battlefield. And I would say this, is that with any historical event, it never ends in a tidy way. And often we want that to happen so that we can then say, well, the causes of the Civil War and the consequences, well, if we wrap it all together, we can see that, you know what? This wasn't some waste of life, or the politicians didn't blunder in the 1850s. And in fact, there were real issues at stake here. And so I will say that the war did end on a satisfactory note. First, the Union preserved. The question of secession, no more. No one's going to raise that again, and they did not. The second issue, slavery's dead, period. Now, look, there are new forms of coercion that emerged in the South. Everyone knows it from, Jim Crow, disfranchisement. However, you cannot buy and sell a black body again.
Any body.
And then you have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that come out of it. That price in blood, I think, in fact, had a revolutionary impact in the moment. It's true. There's some rollback. The hell, that's like any historical moment, yes. But it set the foundation for what I believe is the second. I don't think the first American Revolution was much of a revolution. First revolution, Civil War. Second revolution, Civil rights struggle.
Yeah.
So, yes, I believe it was resolved. Satisfactory.
A dream deferred, but nevertheless a dream that can be realized.
Absolutely. And we should note John Partington, buried in our national cemetery in an unknown grave. John Partington, a man who loved the Union so much, originally from England, loved the Union so much that when he looked at the flag, he wrote to his wife and said that he fought for this country because it embodied the things that he treasured more dearly than anything else. And that, of course, was his wife.
Next time I'm in the cemetery, and I talk about it every tour and go there often. But there's another thing I'm going to bring out thanks to your book. What was happening on November 19th, 1863 in South Carolina to William Walker. We don't have time to get into all that, but I was so
But you just have to get the book.
Get the book.
He's a USCT soldier. We can tell black soldier. Yeah, it's tragic. Tragic.
Who's executed?
Executed.
Well, now you just gave it away. Now why are they going to get the book?
Well, they need to know why he got executed.
Okay, all right. There's more to the story.
Full teaser. And I'd love to talk to you more about.
Well, we're definitely going to do this, man. That's
the
fantastic.
African American experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's so much more to this. I could literally have you here for 4 hours. So we're going to have to do this more often. Okay.
Yeah, I hope so.
All right. Consider yourself a regular then.
Well, I hope you all come to the Civil War Institute conference. I know you have a lot of equipment here, but I'd love for you all to come over to the college and interview some of our speakers. I think
I would kill to do that.
Yeah,
when is that?
We're the second weekend of June. And the second weekend of June, we begin on a Friday night, but then Saturday and Sunday is the core of the conference where we have the speakers, we have breakout sessions, we have concurrent sessions, meaning there's a lot of choice. It's not just battlefield stuff, although it's some of that. It's home front, We have a session on Mary Lincoln. I mean, it's just...
we could do that.
We'd love for you to come out. Yeah.
I would love to do
We'd
that.
set you up
we
somewhere
can,
in the Cub.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah.
We can totally make this portable. I have a portable one to do it. So that would be perfect. Yeah. Thank you for that, by the way. All right. So right here, we got some questions.
Sure.
Every time I have a guest on, I ask my Instagram users to... ask some questions. So here we go.
Ex-girlfriend? Any ex-girlfriends, right?
Yeah, all of them actually are ex-girlfriends.
That's right.
Here's the first one. Matt, why did you leave me? No. Okay. Central Virginia historian on Instagram. He says, North and South, what were the personal motivations that caused men to enlist? So we kind of touched on this a little bit, but like, was there...
They're so extremely varied that it is hard, of course, to identify one thing. But we can go to where I think people are most comfortable, and that's simply to say that for a Southern soldier, it was defense of home. And I would quickly add, though, what did defense of home embody? It's a range of things.
Right.
And what is woven through that society is the institution of slavery. And it is for Northern soldiers, it is the abstraction in 1861 of union. That cause for union, as I've already mentioned, becomes a cause of union and emancipation, right?
And also,
that's the simple, easy answer.
Also to impress a girl.
You know what? There's a big part of that. There's financial reasons as well. I mean, there's just a whole host of things. One of the most, I think, compelling books about why Southern men fought, called All That Makes the Man by Stephen Barry. I have a massive man crush on him. He teaches at the University of Georgia. He writes beautifully. Stephen Barry. He wrote a book on the Todds. He also oversaw a site that you two would, and your listeners would enjoy. It's a website called Private Voices.
Okay.
Private Voices. It's filled with the writings of illiterate and semi-literate Confederate soldiers. And the best news, all the letters are transcribed. They're all typed out.
Oh, nice.
You don't have to read their handwriting.
Don't have to look at them.
Private Voices. Stephen Barry, University of Georgia. Fantastic scholar.
No relation to Chuck?
I doubt it. Okay. He's pretty. Steve's as wide as they come.
Okay. All right. Grant_Delavalle from Instagram wonders, since most Americans didn't travel beyond 30 miles from home, what were some of the common ways soldiers coped with the new way of living and homesickness? In particular, how did they spend the holidays? I guess because Christmas is coming up.
Christmas is coming. Well, I'm going to give you a book. Ready? Catherine.
How do you spell
Meyer Shively, Catherine with a K. I think I'm right about that. And it's called Nature's Civil War. She's dating a guy up here who lives in Gettysburg. He's a historian down in Fredericksburg. If she comes up to town, you guys got to interview her.
Okay.
She teaches history at Virginia Commonwealth University. She did her PhD at UVA. She's writing a biography of Jubal Early. Her book, Nature's Civil War, answers your listener's question. She outlines the range of coping strategies from straggling, which we often see as a lack of discipline, but for her, in her eye, and she's right, it's a way to survive. It's how these men interacted with the environment because they came to see that the environment was pretty tough customer. That's exactly right. For the holidays, men, they are in winter quarters. And so it was a time in which these men often would be overcome by melancholy because they lived in physical dwellings that very much resembled home because that's how they decorated it. Right. They would refer to each other as their better halves. I mean, it was some joking way of getting through it all, but yet they're all struggling, and no surprise here, with what they called the blues. And there's one of the great ironies of the war, right? Both sides fighting for home, fighting for family. It's a source of patriotism and inspiration. There's your sentimentalism. But it's also the Achilles heel. It's what makes you want to throw down that musket and get the hell out and get back home. Yeah. Nature's Civil War, Katie Meyer. She's fantastic. She'd be great.
All right, cool. Okay, another one, Grant D on Instagram. No relation to the previous questioner, or is there? He asks, how did the soldiers react to seeing their friends die? Are there any examples of long-term effects of seeing this on any survivors? I guess he means, like what we call PTSD today or anything like that. But, I mean, to talk to that, though. You grew up with these kids, you enlisted. Maybe this is your cousin, your brother. You're marching into battle, and he's gone.
That's right. So I read this at an archive at Duke University last spring. was Pickett's charge and a Confederate survivor writing comrade's wife. It broke my heart. He said, I had to leave him on the field. He begged me. And he's writing about having to walk away and abandon a man that he feared that either would die from the wound or he's going to fall into enemy hands. And so that emotional loss was something that these men wrote about in very open ways, expressive ways. And I don't know how you handle this on the battlefield when you're giving your tours, but I used to sort of describe these men as emotionally tough and hardened. But in fact, the emotional bond and connection they had surprised them, that they felt more strongly toward these comrades than they often did for family members. And what surprised me is they wrote to their women folk about this. And so, words are all they had. And they often said that that was not enough to be able to convey that sense of loss that they felt, particularly when they had, and you can just imagine this, right? Having to leave a wounded comrade, abandon your friend, right? Knowing God knows what would happen to that person. I just read last night, I'm sure you've read it a million times. I read Chamberlain's piece on Little Round Top for the Hearst magazine. It's very long and it's very graphic and powerful. It's romantic about war. Yeah. And then he writes right after the fighting at Little Round Top, and I'm going to go there in just a little bit, and I'm going to look at those rocks differently now. He writes about how these men, as they sort of scattered after the fighting ended, some of them curling up to these rocks, some of them seeking shelter, they're all just sort of in a daze. It just makes that landscape now sort of come alive. So that sort of speaks again to this as well.
It's like almost like they're reverting to being little boys, children. It's so traumatizing that
that's how you deal with things.
I think even Chamberlain, in a different report, he said, you can imagine these men collapsing to the ground out of exhaustion. I believe I'm correct. He wrote they fell asleep.
Yeah,
I've read that exhausted, just completely passed out, fell asleep.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I love Chamberlain. I'm tired of the backlash against him. Yeah. Okay. After the war, he had a little bit of an ego problem. Okay. So
all right,
what?
So what?
So what? Because you know what Chamberlain did?
Every governor does.
What is truly astonishing about Chamberlain's career, in my mind, it's not Little Round Top. It's what he did during the final 2 weeks of the war. What he did at Lewis Farmhouse, White Oak Road, that preceded Five Forks, all three of those fights in which he is the point of the spear in many cases for these Fifth Corps assaults.
Right.
It's truly remarkable. People don't care about that because it's not Gettysburg.
Right.
I have a little issue with that. I grew up as an interpreter working in the National Park Service in Virginia. I started at Appomattox. And spent almost my entire career at Fredericksburg. So I have
the Central Virginia historian who I asked the question from. He's from Appomattox. All right. So Jason Trinetti, 45, he says, Dr. Carmichael runs a Civil War Institute I'm trying to get into this summer. If you can slip it in, tell him that I'm a big fan of his and mention my name.
Now,
Jason Trinetti.
Jason, we will do all we can. Is he a high school student?
He is. I think he's a senior or a junior in high school, and he loves this place. He's actually, his grandparents brought him down for one of the events that we put on over the summer, cleaning the monuments.
Tell Jason we have a scholarship program, and I'd love for him to apply. We have about 12 high school kids we bring in every year.
All right, awesome. And then finally, Anastasia Jacobi says, "Hi. If you could time travel, what period would you go to?"
Well, I think she's referring to within the Civil War. And
any
period?
Any at all.
Well, of course, it's going to be the Civil War. I'll even be very specific about the moment. It is when the Confederate Army in Northern Virginia retreated across the Potomac River after Antietam, in which there's reserve artillery on the banks on the Virginia side, and the Federals, including, now I'll get it right here, the 118th Pennsylvania, the Corn Exchange Regiment. I made up for that mistake. They cross right, and it's barely a beachhead. But William Nelson Pendleton, the chief of artillery for Lee's army, a man who was a better preacher than he was an artillerist, he scurried from the scene. It's pitch black, wakes Robert E. Lee up and says to Lee, all the reserve artillery has been captured. And Lee says, all of it? He says, all of it. I want that moment. I want to see Lee's face. That's what I want. So
that's a great answer. That's a great answer. I like that. Dr. Pete, this was a real thrill for me. I got to let you go. All right, Pete. Sorry, Pete. Thank you very much for doing this. And thank you to all the Patreon listeners for listening. And we'll talk to you next time.
Great. Thank you.
All right, that was great. Listen,
Awesome.
could you do me a
so
favor?
enjoyed it. Yeah,
My friend,
yeah,
she asked if you would sign this book.
absolutely. Happy to do it. Happy to do it.
Her name is Veronica.
Veronica. Now let's make sure I have been notorious for misspelling. Ver.